You're listening to Little Rockers Radio. Now, many of us are fortunate enough to have the help and support of our parents or parents-in-law when it comes to raising our children, whether it be for general support, advice, soundboarding, or in many cases babysitting for short periods, an afternoon or a night out here and there, or longer periods, 1, 2 or more days a week. Many of us rely on Nan and Pa to help us out. Today we're talking to one of Australia's top parenting experts and the author of 9 parenting books and a granddad himself, Michael Grose, about grandparents and helping with raising our children. Hi Michael, how are you?
Yeah, good Sarah, good.
That's good. Now, as I mentioned, you're a grandfather yourself and about to become, you mentioned, a grandfather again in any day now.
Yes, yeah, my baby's about to have a baby, so I have 3 children, each of them, my eldest 2 have 1 each, and my youngest one is about to have a baby, so which is fantastic.
Now, I was reading on your website, which is parentingideas.com.au, it's extremely common for grandparents to be helping with raising our children, and your site mentions that children who spend considerable time with their grandparents are shown to have healthy self-esteem and do really well in social situations, which obviously as parents, that's what we all want for our children. How does this help?
Yeah, often grandparents they have a different perspective. They often can spend a bit more time with kids than their parents, and that's largely because of a stage of life thing, that often grandparents are not working. They have a little bit more time to spend with kids, and as we know, modern parents are very busy people, usually juggling work, and I guess in many ways, time is in lots of ways the biggest enemy of effective parenting, as I often say, and grandparents tend to have a little bit more time on their side, a little bit more time perhaps to spend in those sort of one-on-one situations. And I think often grandparents make good social coaches for kids as well. And there's also, I find from experience and also just talking to many grandparents as well, that it's often a little bit easier to encourage your kids because you're one step removed. Often as parents we get really caught up in the day-to-day nitty-gritty management of kids, so to speak. So, time spent with the grandparents can be really, positive time. I'm not saying that time spent with parents isn't, but often the time spent with grandparents is far more positive. Often the conversations are very different. And so I think there's a lot of pluses for kids spending time with older adults and their grandparents.
Yeah, in general. And I think probably extending from that just with grandparents, but also I guess I'm a big fan of community environments and raising children, with a sort of community setting, which I think is probably more and more removed these days. But does that whole community raising of children, I guess, plays that same sort of role?
Look, it does. It's been I guess almost a cliche for a long time. We all heard that notion it takes a village to raise a child, and that's a lovely cliche, and it doesn't always happen. So I think modern parenting is a very individual endeavour. We sort of have our own strong views of raising kids, and sometimes we're loath to let go. We're loath to allow other people in some ways, and I see it very much in practical ways sometimes, where if another parent looks a bit askance at our kids, we can go, hang on, what's going on here? Whereas I guess a few generations ago, or that village sort of notion is, okay, please, do it well, but, discipline my child, look after my child. I don't mind if my child gets a different view from you. So that notion of, how does a grandparent contribute to that sort of village is the simple fact that I think that it's a different view. I think kids need to get different views, not just the view of the world from their parents. And so the more adults we expose our kids to, the better. That's a sort of a fundamental belief which I have around childbearing or child rearing, the fact that kids get different views. And I think a generational view is really healthy as well. So I think that's a really important aspect and part of raising kids is allowing our kids to experience different generations and also different people.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously when you think of grandparents, one of the things that's very common these days is for grandparents to help out with babysitting, and it obviously it helps families financially where childcare may be unaffordable or unavailable. And it's great for children, I say, to have that special spoilt time, which is in my case with Nan and Pa. But it does come with stresses for many families in the different ways that we like to parent, I guess. So what's your advice for both parents and grandparents in those situations?
That is a difficult one. My sort of notion is, as grandparents, is to stand back. And to me, it's like parenting. As a parent, I've learned that there's a certain aspect of when your kids become teenagers, you've got to stand back a little bit and allow your kids to make some choices and to support them. But in some ways, it's that early parenting sort of kicks in then when you're parenting your teenagers. I think the same is when your own kids become parents. You've got to stand back and you've got to say, look, I've done the very best I can. Hopefully I've modelled a lot of great parenting. They're also going to pick up their own views because generationally we do have different ways of raising kids. Yeah. Fundamentally, parenting doesn't change all that much. Mothering now is not that much different than mothering 30, 40 years ago or even 400 years ago. It was about nurturance, and those fundamental things don't change. But sometimes the technique changes. I've seen it with my own kids, even just around how they handle sleep issues with toddlers is very different than how I would have handled them. But they're getting good advice. They're doing it their own way, and my job, I see as a grandparent, is actually to sit back and support them and allow them to do it their own way. And so I've found, just looking at parents and grandparents, sometimes tension arises when often around child management, how we manage our kids. And so I think it needs to be some sort of fundamental understandings there as well. So I think that it's grandparents' right to spoil kids.
Yeah.
I think that's important. It's also important for parents to realise that when the kids go to their grandparents' place, that rules might be different. Grandparents may do things slightly differently. And I've seen a little bit of tension there where parents will tell their own parents how they should parent or grandparent their child. So unless there's really extremes, I think actually it's good for kids to experience a bit of different parenting or management or whatever it is, from when they go to grandparents. So it's a two-way street.
Absolutely. And I think my husband didn't have grandparents around at all, and I think he's really missed out on that special bond that we have and the memories that are formed also for children. I know that I have memories of my grandmother twirling me around on the beach, and then I had another nan who we called Lolly Nan and Lolly Pa, because every time we went there they gave us lollies. So, but you're right, it's sort of that supportive and communicative type of role as well, and making sure that you're keeping the communication lines open.
And you touched on something else which I think is important, is that, and I experienced it with my own children. My own children had two different sets of grandparents. One about 20 years older than the other one, so they had the young grandparents, and they were the fun grandparents. And then they had the older grandparents, and they were in their 70s, and one was quite frail. One of the things I noticed, particularly as the kids, as they moved into primary school, is that they adapted really well to both sets. So when they went round to fun grandparents' place, they had fun. They did lots of fantastic things. Yeah. And we used to have to pull them down from the roof when they came home because they were spoilt there. And part of the role is we have to remind them, no, and it's different here when you're at home. However, when they went to their other grandparents, they picked up on the fact that they were different, they were frail. They became far more tolerant, far more patient. So I think what happens in family environments, and it happens similarly if you're in a family with a child with a disability, that will bring out certain attributes in kids. If there is a child with a disability, that often kids become more patient, more tolerant. They have to stand back a little bit. And a similar thing happens with grandparents as well. As kids move out of the toddler stage and early childhood into primary school, I think that kids will adapt quite differently to the different grandparents, and I think that sort of brings different traits out of them. And one of the things I've noticed as a parenting educator over a period of time is that I think grandparents become really valuable assets when children move into when they become adolescents. In many ways, it's what I call a shared enemy. Sometimes that teenagers can have interesting relationships with their parents, and often they'll look outside their family for someone whom they can talk to, go to advice, just form a relationship with, and often grandparents can play a really, really terrific role, with taking an interest in teenagers, just talking with them, almost being a quasi-parent during that stage.
Absolutely, and that's a stage that myself and many of our listeners have got to look forward to in the future. Now, I did also just want to touch on, and I couldn't actually find a percentage for this, you may know, but there's tens of thousands of grandparents out there who take on the primary role of raising their grandchildren, and obviously in these cases there's, I believe, extra layers of stress for the grandparents and potentially grief as well from whatever the family situation may have been. What advice do you have for grandparents who are taking on or are in the primary role of raising their grandchildren, and how do they get extra support, or where can they go for extra support?
Look, it's a hard one. With at a certain stage, grandparents become the primary carer, and at a certain stage, in some ways you almost cease being the grandparent. You become almost the parent. And that sort of line is crossed when often around management. It's often, when I say management, it is grandparents who are doing the almost the discipline. They're managing the day-to-day parenting, doing the school pickups, make sure homework's done, or if it's going to creche, picking them up from creche, doing feeding, doing all of that management side of things. And suddenly you sort of cross over from being the grandparent to being a parent. And that's a difficult one. There's not that much around. I think really what we know is for parents, when they're looking for advice, they're looking for, often go to schools, often the doctor, or even they're looking for early learning or childcare educators for advice. And I think it's quite similar for grandparents as well. There's not that much around that I know of around sort of grandparents who are parents advice. And I see increasingly more and more parents come along to my parenting seminars, and they're older, and they're obviously they're grandparents. One of the issues there is that the hard issue is kids now are different in many ways than when they were bringing up their own kids.
Yes.
So that's a difficulty. So it's almost finding out, what's normal and what's not in this day and age. Methodology has changed, so the way we manage kids, the way we discipline kids has changed, and even the language has changed. One of the things I've noticed being involved in parenting for 25 years is the language which I use with parents now is quite different in many ways than the language which we may have used 12 years ago. An example of that is I talk a lot about resilience now, and parents talk to me, how do I make my child resilient? 15 years ago, that word wasn't in the landscape. So there's a lot around language as well. So, and I've know a few grandparents who are primary carers, and they're turning to their children's school. They're joining in with some of the parents themselves as in playgroup, etc. as well. And it's been almost back to the future in some ways.
And as I said, it can come with a whole range of other layers of stress and grief for the family situation as well. Now, more information on a lot of what we've spoken about today can be found on your website, which is parentingideas.com.au, and your website is fabulous. It has a host of information on raising children, and you've mentioned the word resilience. That's one thing that I'm constantly looking at as well. So for anyone that's listening and wants more information, they can go to parentingideas.com.au.
Okay, thank you. And probably the easiest way, and we find a lot of grandparents as well as parents sign up to Happy Kids, and Happy Kids is a newsletter which I put out once a week, and it's been around for about 18 years. And that's probably one of the most useful ways of just staying in touch. And I see that as my way. It's an article comes out, or a couple of articles come into your email box once a week, and I find that's a good way, and it's my way of keeping parents up to date with with latest ideas, techniques. So that's a really good way of staying in touch with my ideas, and also just a way of staying abreast of modern parenting by just signing up to Happy Kids, which is on the parentingideas.com.au website.
That's right, okay. And the links to your website and to that we'll also put up on our site at littlerockersradio.com.au. Thank you so much for taking time out to join us today. I really appreciate it.
That's a pleasure, Sarah.
Thank you. That was Michael on Little Rockers Radio. Thanks for listening.